Good morning, everybody. Thank you for waiting. We're running slightly behind, 2 minutes late. My name is Ewan Leach. I'm the Chief Executive of SURF, and welcome to our People in Place network meeting. The event is being recorded because we put it online afterwards so that a wider audience can have a look at it. So if you could all mute your microphones so that audio is okay, and feel free to have your screen on or off. This morning, we're looking at local place plans. From a SURF perspective, we're interested in how national and local policy works for communities and for local authorities. And at our meeting in March, we had Trossachs and Foyer's Development Trust talking about work that they were doing primarily around 20-minute neighbourhoods. But at that event, there was they talked about the fact that they had been forming a local place plan, and in the Q&A there became a huge number of questions about local place plans, about exactly what they were, how they were getting on with it, how they'd commissioned it, and so we were aware back in March that there was an appetite for more information about local place plans. Arguably, local place plans are the relatively new kid in the policy block within the planning system. So we began looking at how we could have an event that looked at local place plans. And subsequently, Community Land Scotland, they had two events about the local place plans in Wester Hales and Kinning Park, which was about the warts and all process of a community leading on a local place plan, and also some reflections on what that meant for local authorities, because from a local authority perspective, they're also new. So local authorities, and looking at who is booked on today, there's a high amount of interest in local place plans from local authority people who work in planning departments. So we thought hosting an event on this would be the right thing to do. It's July. I'm impressed that none of you are on holiday, or maybe if you are on holiday and you're doing this from your holiday, and congratulations for being so committed to local place plans. So we didn't know how many people would come, but it turns out more of you are available in July than we had anticipated. So it's good to have so many people in the room. So our agenda for this morning is fairly straightforward. It follows the format that we usually have. We have two presentations. Our first presentation is from Paul Lead of PAS, who have been providing training on local place plans to communities. And so we've invited Paul along to reflect upon both for this training they provide and how it's landing with communities, and his maybe personal perspective on what it can mean for communities in the longer term. And then we've invited Fiona Jackson and Susan Brooks from Loch, Lomond and Trossachs National Park, because as far as we can tell, they were the first out the traps in terms of having a register for local place plans, and it's available on our website, and with guidance around how to do it. We know that other local authorities are doing it. I noticed last week that East Lothian are doing calls for local place plans just now, and it's very clear the intent is to make sure local place plans are done within the kind of next 18 months to feed into their next development plan, which is a very sensible way of doing that. That won't be the order that all local authorities are doing it in, particularly the ones that have just recently completed their development plans. So the format is we'll have speakers, and then we'll have a Q&A. There will be a break at 10:55. And then it'll restart again at 11:10 with the intent to close at 12:15. So your questions, you can either type them in the chat at the side when it comes to the Q&A, or you can raise your hand and unmute and share your question in the room. So I'd now like to introduce Paul Eade from PAS. Thank you very much for agreeing to do this, Paul. I think everyone's very interested to hear more about PAS's approach to local place plans and the training you're giving. Over to you.
Great, thanks, Ewan. Just screen sharing now. Hopefully you can all see that.
We can.
Why it's good that communities are declining to prepare local place plans, and why it's good that some are taking on the challenge. My name's Paul Eade. I'm Social Enterprise Manager with Planning Aid Scotland, but I want to stress that in this presentation, all these views are my own. And also just to say, it's a real privilege to be here. There are a lot of names in this group that I have learned a lot from. And I'm also aware that my own manager is here, so Ian McPherson. So I better get this right, or I might get a little bit of a bollocking. Anyway, it's great to be here. So who the heck am I? Why should I be able to stand up here and say anything? Many of you, maybe from more of an institutional background, won't know who I am, because I only career changed into planning a few years ago. But before that, I was a community leader and community development worker volunteer, in fact, in Postle Park in North Glasgow. And towards the end of my time there, I took up the challenge of working alongside local community leaders to develop a little mini proto-local place plan called Our Hammy Hill to try and speak into, to share the community voice of our area into the development management process. And I was also involved in setting up the local group Friends of Postle Park Green Space that did about 6 years of groundwork before the charrette that launched the transformation of the clay pits, which is now being put forward for a urbanism award, which is pretty cool. In other words, I want to say that I spend half of my time speaking to community development people about planning and trying to explain what planning actually is, and the other half of the time facing the other direction, trying to encourage planners to understand what it looks like from a community perspective. And what I've noticed is that there are definitely blind spots from each different group. It's difficult for planners and institutional actors sometimes to understand the complicated relational and resource environment that community leaders face. And it's difficult for community leaders to see the complicated legal and policy framework that planners have to work under. It leads to quite a lot of frustration on both sides. I also just want to observe that in terms of the policy that has and legislation that's enabled local place plans to happen, sometimes I do ask myself the question, do the folk that created that really understand what they've invited and asked communities to do? And as planners, I would hope that we would never approve a development like the photo on the right-hand side. But in a sense, it feels sometimes to community groups that there's a door that's been opened somewhere high up on a wall, but there's no steps to get up there. And it's frustrating and confusing. And I just want to say that some communities are making a choice to not even try and get to that door. And for them, that's probably a good choice. And I'll explain why a little bit more. So I helped rewrite what's now become the PAS Guide for Community Delivery of Local Place Plans. You can download this for free from the pas.org.uk website. And I'm involved in both training community groups and also delivering and project managing local place plans and community action plans across Scotland. And the guide aims to make it, or to start trying to demystify the process of what it might be to create a local place plan. For example, it has an appendix in there with an actual simple tick list of all the elements that would need to be ticked off for a local place plan to be validated and accepted as such. And in Fife recently, with the support of the Rural Development Group in Fife, we've been doing capacity building and mentoring and laying some steps out for community groups who are leading and delivering their own local place plans. So we've set up a training program. We've offering one-to-one mentoring with groups and individual leaders. And we've created every 2 weeks, we have a lunchtime learning cohort meeting with community leaders from across Fife who then offer peer-to-peer support and input for just-in-time learning to make sure that they're moving forward in the right way and feel confident about it. So we've served, the first section in earlier the year, we served about 15 different groups across Fife. Some of you are here, which is great. And we then got re-upped. So we're doing that all the way through to December, which should hopefully support groups who need to get their LPP in Fife in by January. So our whole hope in the midst of all this is to develop a centre for best practice. So we've created and are creating a suite of training modules. You can see a list of what we've prepared already here, starting with an intro to local place plans, a module how to convert CAPs into local place plans, if that's the goal of the community group, how to project manage, how to do facilitation, how to deal with conflict, how to use the place standards, engagement strategies, running online events, how to develop climate-ready local place plans. Something that's often missed out, data analysis, how to prioritize the things that you actually want to do and what might make it through to the plan, how the heck you make the connections to MPF4 and what that even is, and then writing the plan and making maps that work for it. And ultimately, we're imagining that people will be able to submit draft local place plans to the PAS advice service, and ideally would be looking out for RTPI planners from other regions to have a glance over that and help maximize the power of the policies that people might be putting forward to justify their ideas. So what I want to do for you today, firstly, is just give you a little intro to our taster for local place plans, because part of what we have to do, we've discovered we need to do, is to just clear the decks for communities to help bring a bit of clarity amidst the confusion that they're facing. So I'm going to do a little spin, and you're getting it for free. There you go. So right at the heart of this, what we do in the intro to local place plans is that what we're leading communities to do and hoping that they'd be able to do by the end is to sit down and go a cost-benefit analysis. Should we do this LPP thing? Do we even need to? What's it going to take? And to make an informed choice about that. And I consider that a good outcome from that is that a community group would make an informed choice not to, as much as to do it. It's that the key thing is informed choice, and part of that is helping explain what the difference between a community action plan and a local place plan is. And I think that's important because there is confusion out there amongst institutional groups and communities, right? So what is a community action plan? Here's my take. It's community-led. It's a list of initiatives. It becomes a list of initiatives for change. It can be wide-ranging over a number of different topics. It can put forward ideas for shaping service delivery across multiple council planning departments and propositions for advocacy to making those change happen. And it enables working together at the grassroots and community groups to step up, see above the parapet, because often our focus is just doing our thing, and actually get coordinated. And it's usually and often supported by and supporting community planning and CLD. Here's a little phrase: CAPs are more than just a plan. They can help communities understand what they want to be like in the future and help to develop a positive community identity. They can help develop local connections and collaborations and develop community capacity and improve social capital. They can support community aspirations on the big challenges for a future Scotland, such as responding to the global climate emergency and tackling inequalities. They are an opportunity for real community-based change. That's quite a breathless mouthful, but I guess there is the potential for that within a community action plan. But of course, most community action plans wouldn't have like a map in it or a concrete spatial element or vision. And here's an example from a proto-LPP that Paz did in Buckhaven, where I live, in Fife a few years ago. And this is basically one of the two core map elements that would need to be in an LPP to get validated. In addition to a boundary around the community council area or maybe settlement boundary that the community group is working in, you need a map with a bunch of numbers on it pointing out exactly where the policies or proposals that you're putting forward are as a legend, and then you go and basically list them out. Those are the two core maps that you definitely need to have to get validated. A local place plan, then, what's the difference? So, okay, it's a community-led plan in the guidance that sets out proposals for the development and use of land. It sets out community proposals for regulating and shaping the development and use of land, but with reasoning. It must have reasoning attached to each of those proposals. You don't usually need to do that in a community action plan. And the goal is to influence the planning department specifically. It must be taken into account during the process of forming an LDP. A validated local place plan is a material consideration that must be taken into account during that process. Now, community action plans aren't usually used to influence planning departments. They often say a lot of stuff about to other departments, but not usually planning. And they also don't have to be taken into account. It's a new thing. LPPs also become a material consideration when validated in site-specific planning applications that come down the pipes in the future, whether or not it's yet been accounted for in the LDP. If it says something about a site-specific application, it should now be taken into account during the assessment process. And it needs to be developed in the context of NPF4 and LDP policies. In other words, the way I put it, it's about the where of policy. You're basically saying, this is where I think things should happen and how that development should happen in this particular place. So here's some differences. A cap is not a material consideration in the planning system, not according to the recent development management guidelines. But in the new development planning guidelines, it says that a cap may be taken into account as a material consideration in LDP formation. Whereas in LPP, the wording is must. The phrasing matters. There's a difference there. A council authority can proactively grab an idea from a CAP if they want to. If they've got a validated LPP, they must take it into account and give reasoning why they have or haven't accepted that proposal. An LPP must requires certain process elements by law, that list that I gave you at the beginning, and it must include a spatial vision for the area. It must also have a list of policy proposals, whereas a CAP usually has a delivery plan. But because an LPP is designed really to try and shape policies that are being used in turn to shape development and use of land, you don't have to have a delivery plan in a local place plan. And of course, CAPs can address issues beyond the use and development of land. Now, we teach communities this to sort of pull these two things apart. And some of you are already feeling a bit uncomfortable about that. But what that moment does is it brings some real clarity to communities, and there's been lots of aha moments when I've done that. And then we go into what I call the land and development quiz. So some of you may want to try and write down some answers to this. So basically, I'm going to list a few things that you might want to put into a CAP or an LPP, and I want you guys to think about what is the appropriate one to put them into. Here we go. Litter management and dog fouling, CAP or LPP. Improvements in the town centre, CAP or LPP. Conservation of the built environment. Proposals for a carpool or community bus. Potholes or street cleaning. Strategies to help local groups collaborate. Adding value and detail to existing LDP policies. And issues around health service provision. There's a little note. See in the top right-hand corner, when I do this presentation, we link it all back to our PAS guide. So if you're interested in what issues should or shouldn't or might not be applicable as land and built environment issues, there's a good list in our guide on page 5. Anyway, let's see how I answered these. So I would say litter management and dog fouling is for a community action plan. There's nothing that a spatial planning department can do with that. Improvements in the town centre can be for an LPP. So there's an invitation to put ideas forward about that. At the same time, it could also be for a CAP, depending on what you're trying to achieve. So if you're wanting to set up a group to build out planters and pop them on the street, that's probably a CAP issue. But if you're wanting to advocate for shared surface, LPP. Conservation of the built environment, I would say LPP, in that if you're thinking that you want to advocate for an extension to your conservation area boundary in your community, that's an LPP thing. But if you want to set up a heritage group to transform a building, that's a CAP thing. Proposals for a carpool or community bus, that's a CAP thing. Potholes and street cleaning, that's for a community action plan. There's nothing that a spatial planning department can do about that. Strategies to help local groups collaborate, a CAP can do that. Add value and detail to existing local development plan policies, that's for an LPP. Issues around health service provision. Well, it's kind of difficult for either a CAP or an LPP to deal with, because a CAP can't control whether general practitioners choose to have a practice in your community. But if you want to have housing development coming up and thought, well, maybe we just need to make sure there's some land allocated for a potential future GP surgery, yeah, I would put that into a CAP. So how did you do? Anyway, however you came out with that, the point is that they serve different purposes and they can do different things. I would argue that an LPP from a community perspective is an extra arrow in the quiver. It's not a replacement for a community action plan. It's an extra arrow in the quiver to influence the spatial planning department and to influence the local development plan. And we've never had that before. It's the equivalent of a developer being able to put forward a proposal during the call for sites phase. That's new, it's quite powerful, potentially. However, that doesn't mean that we can't also do a CAP at the same time. But I would say only do an LPP to a community if you really need to, because there's extra work and extra burdens. If you're not looking for those kind of outcomes from your work together as a community and strategizing, just don't do an LPP. We've always done CAPs, we still can, we'll be doing them in the future. LPP is not just a new name for a CAP. and there is confusion out there around this. It's got a particular power to influence spatial planning. So it's not a wish list to demand unrealistic investment from others. It's not a top-down way of imposing change. It's not a means of stopping live development proposals. It's not an opportunity to promote individual interests of specific people or organizations. And it's not an easy way of getting what you want. But I think we promote, from an institutional perspective, some of the confusion between what an LPP is and what a CAP is. So that quote I gave you about a CAP earlier is actually a description of what the Our Place website describes an LPP as. So you see here in this lozenge, it says, however, local place plans are more than just a plan. It can help communities understand what they want to be like in the future and develop a positive community identity. Now, here's the thing, CAPs have always been able to do everything in that box, but suddenly we're claiming that local place plans can do all of that as well. Now, they can, but you don't have to do a local place plan to do all that stuff. The first paragraph is very accurate description because it's almost lifted straight from the guidance. And I think we have to just be really careful not to confuse communities about all this stuff. Having said all of that, now that we've taken that all apart, aha moments, right? You could still do an LPP and a CAP side by side. If you're going to put out the net, you're going to catch fishes and crabs. You're going to get stuff that's relevant to an LPP and stuff that's relevant to a CAP. You can just keep them. You can keep all of that catch if you wanted to. And you can do an LPP side by side with a CAP, or maybe you can do an LPP after a CAP. There's different ways of approaching it, sequentially or side by side. But don't get them confused. Don't submit an LPP that's a CAP in all but name, because you miss the power of policy to argue your case to change the development plan. Do present a document that clearly lays out the different elements relevant to an LPP, either in a separate chapter or in your policy proposal sections. Put forward, okay, we want to develop this community garden, and this community group's going to do it, and we need to buy the land, and then have a separate box saying, in LPP terms, we want to ensure and ask the community, the council, to allocate that land for a change of use from vacant and derelict land, whatever it was previously, to community garden. And you keep it separate and clear between the two. Anyway, that doesn't mean even that you need to do an LPP. There are lots of other alternatives. You could do a CAP. That might be right for you. You can still get involved in regular statutory council consultations in the local development plan. You could do participation requests. That's maybe what you're really trying to do, or community asset transfer, or even submitting a planning application on your own right. Now, if any of these things count for a community, it's really, really good that they decline to do a local place plan. That's what I'm getting at. We need to ensure that communities understand the meaning of what the options before them, and not just jump on the new thing to thinking that that's what's right for them. So here's some other stuff. Here's some other reasons why it's good that communities are declining to prepare local place plans. Like I say, we take them through this journey and eventually ask them, is an LPP the right choice for you, to try and do a cost benefit analysis. And I think we should all, as professionals and practitioners, be ensuring that we're helping and hand-holding communities through this decision-making process for themselves. Because there is a very big difference between a community-led process and a community-delivered process. PAS's work is always community-led. We serve the community as a client, but then we bring a bunch of extra resource to support them as we work alongside them. But communities delivering their own local place plans, that's a huge ask. That's a big set of steps up to that door. And we need to be really, we need to let that sink into ourselves if we're not realizing quite what we're expecting or asking communities to do. So why are communities declining to prepare LPPs? Well, CAP's sometimes enough. Some folk we've heard, they've gone, oh, wow, it's optional. An LPP is optional. We feel like we've been told that we have to do this. Funding, there is no money or support from central sources. The Making Places Fund stopped in 2018. It's been amalgamated into investing in communities, massively oversubscribed, and rightly, a lot of the money went to poorer communities, but not really often from LPP work. And the problem is that also funders, grant giving trusts, still see resilience as a response to COVID rather than as a foundation for a resilient future. an LPP or a CAT would enable communities to get that baseline understanding of how they want to work together to develop their resiliency for the future. Expectations, some communities take on too much. I've seen communities try and do a district scale local place plan as volunteers. That's really, really tough to attempt to do that rather than at neighbourhood scale. Some communities think that LPPs are like some kind of new silver bullet that will make the council do exactly what they want. It's neither of those things, and humility is needed. And sometimes it's good just to say, actually, that's not what we thought it was. Energy, there's a real danger of burnout and damaged relationships. I'm seeing groups beginning to fall out because they don't have the resources to do it. And it's just not worth it. As a former volunteer community leader, mental well-being, if that starts getting challenged in your group, seriously consider just stopping. It's not worth it. Results, how much of what we want might we get at the end? You might not get anything. The local authority remains the actual decision maker in law, and they could argue against every single one of your proposals in material planning terms, and that'd be legitimate. So you could put a huge amount of work in and get nothing out the back end. You need to realize this up front. Many groups that I'm encountering, folk on the groups don't even know what the local outcomes improvement plan or the local development plan actually is. And they begin to feel real anxiety and confusion of the multiple layers of plans. And then they see something like West Hales and they go, we can't do that because, well, £150,000 was spent on that one. There are other ways of doing it. There's not much support. Third sector communities and public sector community development workers often don't understand planning, let's be honest. And flip side, public sector planners don't necessarily understand community development, and they're not necessarily talking to each other. Local politics, we found even powerful groups want PAS to come in for outsider impartial support, because the politics, sticking your head above the parapet locally, is intense. It's not for protest, it's for a positive vision. It's not to be anti-development. Oh, right, okay, well, that's kind of what we're wanting to do. Okay, well, there's other ways of doing it, but you need to put forward a positive vision. And it's a learning curve. What we're expecting communities to do is to work together, project manage the process, understand the guidance and legislation, and get enough planning policy to get the best bang for their buck, and do all that in a tight time frame. I mean, Falkirk 2026 before an LPPs needs to be submitted. 5th January. That's pretty intense. And even though that was advertised in May last year, it takes a long time for communities to catch up. And then institutional happenstance. In Argyllshire, the LDP is actually with the ministers right now. So they've had to tell community groups that even if you do an LPP and submit it and it's validated, it's not going to be taken into account for, I reckon, at least 5 years, depending on how NPF4 compliant their current LDP is. So, plus, here's some of the roles that a community group might need to fill. Steering group members, admin, fundraising, communications, volunteer coordination, design and graphic support if they want to go that way, event and discussion facilitation, analysis and plan writing. To which I would say to practitioners and institutional actors in this room, would you step up and lead an LPP in your community? Would you do it? Are you doing it? Because it's a big ask. Why it's good that some communities are taking on the challenge. So here's some good stuff. Okay, it's a proactive role for the first time. Community councils and other groups can actually say positively what they want to see in the system rather than just react potentially negatively and object to individual applications that come in. That's a good thing. It can be a foundation for community wealth building. So Tom Arthur says we need to move from redistribution as a government to pre-distribution, meaning communities get control of their own local assets and generate their own local economy and make stuff happen for themselves so that the government don't have to step in quite so much. Great thing. But to do that, you have to do what I call pre-distribution, which is enable communities to figure out for themselves what their plan is and get on the front foot as they move forward for community wealth building. Pre-distribution, but there's no money for that. There's no steps. So, okay, we want community wealth building, but we can't even help communities get off on the front foot. However, those that are can be really, really good and could be a good foundation. Influence, it's the community equivalent of call for sites. So communities can now actually put in right up front in the LDP process, like developers have been able to do for ages. and sometimes feeling a little bit upset at the moment that communities now have the option and actually influence stuff. That's good. Climate change, we need coordinated local responses to climate change. And this is a vehicle to help do that. I strongly believe that. However, on the flip side, just as a caveat, there seems to be, if you do a community survey in lots of communities, and this isn't the case for all of them at all, you might get very, very little back about climate change if you're just asking open questions. Like in Pitt and Wee, we had 150 responses and only 2 comments on the importance of climate change. So climate literacy, despite the national and regional emergency, is still an issue. Harnessing gifts, communities are bringing forward their gifts and their time and energy. That's brilliant. Can we trust communities with those gifts? That's the challenge to institutional actors. Can we really trust folk to do this stuff? Peer-to-peer support in Fife, we've got leaders not just coming to the learning cohort, but they're literally going to each other's sessions and training each other, which is a fantastic result. Some are a bit further ahead than others, and they're just helping each other along the journey. That's excellent. Proactive landowners, we've got in Kingsbarns, we've got the local landowner is on the steering group of the community group that's developing a local place plan for their area and helping the community understand what his issues are and what his goals are and supporting them to think about what they want also from his land. Wow, that's really proactive. Talk about landowner rights and responsibilities and discharging it. That doesn't happen in every community. We can use local place plans to integrate and connect national, regional, and local policies and public accountability. Planning departments must take into account, must provide an account for the decisions they make based on the back of an LPP being a material consideration. And communities are going to be able to read that. That's not been the case before with just pure consultation on an LDP. Watching my time. Hope I can still go for a little bit more, Ewan. Okay, so here's an example of what a community can do as they put forward their proposal, just to give you an idea. So this is Octomukty, big field to the south of Octomukty, below Low Road. Blue square is a community playing field. Red square is where the community wants to expand that playing field. The rest of the field is there's an option on it with the local landowner by a housing developer who has up to now been refused housing development. You can bet your bottom dollar that that developer, and I'm not anti-development, I mean, housing is really, really important, right? You can bet your bottom dollar that right now that developer is putting forward, using planners to put forward an extraordinarily robust case to argue for that site to finally be allocated in Fife's new local development plan. Now, Octomukty Community Council and Development Trust can also put their proposal forward for that red square and argue for that in policy terms and give the planners at Fife Planning Department a decision to make between the materiality and meaning of both of those options. More of an equal playing field, literally. And that's pretty powerful. Potentially that site could get allocated by the planners for a playing field, and that, despite the option, would stop housing or make it very hard for housing to go there. It could also result in some kind of mediated process where the housing developer realizes if we give that bit up front to the community and help them do it, maybe the planners of the spatial plan department will let us do the housing. So a bit of mediation may happen. So I'm coming to the end, and I'm just going to finish with a few provocations, and you can see an image of a barroom brawl. And if that happens, that's great, because I know at the end of it, we'll all kiss and make up, and we're all mature people. Maybe these aren't as provocative as I think they are, but hopefully they will be. So I want to just go through these real briefly. Here's the thing. Do communities who've submitted an LPP even know what they're designed to do? I've seen a few that don't seem to understand that you should use a local place plan to use powerful arguments from planning policy to make it difficult for local authority planners to refuse your proposal for a piece of land. That's what you could try and do. But often what we're getting is just caps, or it seems to me. That now they could be interpreted by the planning department, but is that as robust as what developers might be putting forward through serious commercial planner listing out the power of policy to argue for a weighted judgment in their favour? Do community development workers need to invite collaboration and training from planners rather than just imagining what LPP should be for? What is RTPI Scotland's public position on LPPs? Is RTPI Scotland invested in them, representing professional planners? We all say that we worship Jane Jacobs, but we mistrust those trying to follow in her footsteps. Are we going to step up as planners and actually advocate for communities doing this stuff? Here's another one. Humza Yousaf has recently said every penny and pound of future SG commitments will be examined to ensure it is targeted at tackling poverty, right? Does that mean that the money that is allocated by PARD partner grants to PARD partner organizations is being ring-fenced to ensure that they create jobs to help communities with the least resources to develop local place plans? I'm not seeing it. But what I am seeing is what we all feared, which is a lot of wealthier communities getting off the starting blocks and leaving the poorer communities behind. We say we don't have any money, but there's a lot of money that goes to PARD partners and that could be ring-fenced for poor communities. Here's another one. Will local authorities honour the community investment that's being put into this? Will we pick up these plans and actually distribute the information and consultation and energy through our departments and make sure that it gets absorbed in every different silo? Will we set up teams to make that happen? Because that's the delivery question from a local authority point of view. And I'm going to also say one more, if it's okay, or a couple more. We have an army of policy officers, so it seems to me, and we need policy officers, but we have an army of them developing national and regional policy. But apparently there's no money to pay people, policy officers, to help communities develop their own local policy documents. That's what an LPP is. That's what a CAP is. I think it's a policy document. But we're not investing in local policy in that sense. Is it time to reinvent the role of policy officers in our organisations to help communities do this stuff? Can we have a national register of LPPs? Just one? That would be really helpful. Just one place where it's going to happen. And here's another one. Are we going to see multiple different approaches to assessment of LPPs across multiple different councils? Because we've got really clear guidance about validation processes. But as far as I'm aware, every local authority is going to create its own approach to assessing LPPs. That's possibly a recipe for difficulties and postcode lotteries as to how things work out. So I'm going to finish with this. A challenge for planners and local authorities. Are we going to honour community investment in these plans? Are we going to have a team to ensure goals are integrated and assessed across silos once they're validated and submitted? Are we going to just step up a little bit and help community groups that haven't quite articulated their policy proposals in the right planning language and fill in some of the policy gaps? Or are we just going to put a big cross against it because they haven't quite said the right words? For communities, we need to recognise that officers are often struggling with their own complex context and have a bit of grace for them, I think. But also have grace for one another as we try and work through this stuff because it's really complicated. And for everyone, I think we're all learning. I've had people actually put me somehow say that I'm some kind of expert in LPPs. I'm like, if I'm anything, I'm 5 seconds ahead of everybody else because we are all learning right now. And it needs, these problems that we're facing are so wicked, we're only going to crack them if we're really humble. LPPs might be one of those vehicles, but the jury's still out. So that's what we're doing. Maybe your local authority wants to support groups but doesn't have quite enough money to pay for professionals to help them do it. You might do what Fife does and set up a mentoring program and learning cohort. Get in touch with us if you want to do that. We've got this suite of training modules. Maybe your community group or network wants to figure out how to do this stuff and need some training. That's what we're here for. If it's neither of those things, please just signpost us anyway. I'm very grateful for your time. I'm going to stop there.
Thank you very much, Paul. That was great. I think some of the comments that were coming in, do we need a new policy? And it's called CLAP. Is it a community local action place plan? Because I think some of there were questions coming in which you answered around the timing of whether or not you do a CAP or a local place plan. And I suppose, well, if it's CLAP, do we have to include LOIP in it as well? so that we bring all those acronyms together. Because one of my reflections would be, do communities really care what the name of the thing is that the legislation and policymakers require? Do they care about what happens in their place across multiple levels? Yes. Do they need to know the technicalities of it? Possibly not. I don't know the technicalities of some of the health systems in the area that I live in because I haven't had to engage with them, but I'd want them to be good. Fundamentally, but planning is one where we do engage the community more. One of the questions is, what does PARD stand for?
Oh, sorry. Hang on. Am I back on mute?
No.
Okay, great. Yeah, I was making. Forgive me. I was making certain assumptions as a sort of practitioner in that work, but I also recognised that I might needed to. So PARD that's the new acronym for the amalgamated Scottish government department that was previously separate departments of planning, architecture, and regeneration. So this year they've been integrated into one department, and each of them used to distribute certain monies to certain PARD partners, like PAS is one of them. I think SURF is another one.
SURF, we're from the regeneration bit, yeah.
Yeah, now there's sort of one pot, and but there's still, the government still has money to distribute, and it can make choices around what its expectations are of us as partners.
What some of the questions that are coming in, so around timing of things. So there's been a lot of expression of appreciation for I appreciate the honesty, and I think I would say that your definition, your opening stuff around CAP versus LPP is incredibly helpful, because the LPPs that we do see, I think we've all acknowledged that there's a huge amount of non-spatial issues within them, which are community action plans or other plans. But the timing of them, I think you talked about the fact that Argyll are currently waiting for their local plan to be adopted. It's with ministers. I think Edinburgh's in the process of a similar situation. If a community creates an LPP and it's registered, does it not still become a material consideration in decision making?
Yeah, so thank you. It's really important to clarify that. So there's two main things that an LPP can do. It can influence development planning, and it can influence development management. Now, the deadlines that councils have to put out are designed to say, look, if you want to influence the local development plan, the process of us putting that together in the next round of painting our fourth road bridge, there needs to be a point where we can say, okay, at this moment, if it's validated and registered, we're going to be able to have time to properly assess that and give an account for it. Now, if you miss that, you might miss that deadline or not have an opportunity to hit that within this current cycle. Or, so that could happen. So your LPP in that case initially wouldn't necessarily be able to influence the actual local development plan formation process, but it would still be validated and remain on the public register as a material consideration that should be taken into account by any site-specific application that comes in by the case officer that's assessing it, and brought into the argumentation within their report of handling, and used and weighed up as just like any other material consideration. Now, they might just find against it, particularly if your policy, the danger is your policy, LPPs, you can argue for a change to the local development plan or an alternative policy on a particular site. Then a planner is going to have to weigh up the weighting of the statutory policy that's in the LDP, and weigh up the material considerations that might encourage them to go against that, of which one of them might be a proposal in a local place plan. But you're probably going a bit uphill on that in that particular scenario. But in development management terms, yes, even if it's not been registered by the deadline for development planning, a local place plan will still be on file as a material consideration.
So in my reading, so the East Lothian Council process that's happening just now, if all the communities created local place plans that inform the local development plan, arguably the local place plans could become redundant because all the information gets absorbed into the local development plan, which I know but it could happen that 100% of the information was taken in, and then it would be a great local development plan led by communities. But even if they don't meet that deadline, the information is still relevant to decision making, actually on a case by case scenario.
It's just, yeah. I mean, it would be like, in a sense, from a community perspective, it would be a dream scenario if all their policies in an LPP were actually accepted by the local case officers into the LPP, because then they would become statutory policy and statutory weighting. I think it's more realistic. Some communities are like, is it all or nothing? Do they, when on assessment, does it all have to be accepted or not? And that's not the case. That my understanding is that each policy would be looked at, and what the most likely scenario is that some of the policies might be taken forward as statutory policies or proposed as such. Others, with explanation, would be, well, that's a no, because I think I'm 5 seconds ahead of everyone else. I'm probably
okay. So there's some good questions coming in. One of them from earlier, which I don't know, is around local development plans. I think it used to be described as the spatial expression of local economies. Is there can there be an economic driver to a local place plan?
I don't see why not. So I agree. In a sense, I kind of think of the local development plan as the spatial expression of the local outcomes improvement plan. The local development plan itself should be, and does in many cases have, important economic policies within them, because if you don't get that bit right, then you can seriously stymie economic development. I mean, what kind of stuff
you could ask for industrial units. I mean,
communities would be saying, well, could you allocate land? Sorry, I mean, could you allocate land for a local live work unit or something like that? And a lot of communities that I'm encountering in the Highlands are saying, we'd love for there to be some more dedicated small business office space to enable local entrepreneurship, and you could argue for that kind of thing.
And I think in cities you can see as low-grade industrial space is eradicated for housing or for student housing options within some urban centres. You know, where does that kind of low-grade industrial car mechanics, etc., where do they go? And communities saying we need space for that would be a legitimate one. Other questions that have come in are one from Claire Simmons was asking question about options. How did the community find out there was an option on the playing field in your example in Buckhaven?
Well, Claire, I'm not sure we've ever met, but the truth is, options are basically legal agreements that don't have to be made public. That's my understanding. So that can be a real issue, unless if a community approaches the landowner and they say, we'd like to do this, and the landowner says, you might get a sense from the local landowner what the situation is if they've already got an option. But you can't force the knowledge of that legal agreement to be made public, as far as I understand, that's part of the frustration, I guess, is that there's the land ownership issues and the legalities around land ownership, not just trying to influence planning policy. I'm sure there are people much better qualified to answer some of these questions. I'm just having a stab.
It's a helpful reflection on the opaque nature of some aspects of which come around ownership and leases. Michael Warren's got a really good question. As NPF4 is now part of the statutory development plan, is it legitimate for LPPs to challenge NPF4, the one ring that rules us all? He doesn't say that. Sorry. All the guidance suggests that it can only influence LPPs, but significant decisions have already been taken at a national level. I don't know what your take on that would be.
Well, one thing I do say to communities is, okay, you're trying to use an LPP to influence your forthcoming local development plan, which in Highlands the goal is the new local development plan would be adopted in 2027, and so the invitation is to create an LPP right now. And communities are like, well, how do we even know what might be coming forward? And what I'm saying to them is, you already know what is going to be in your local development plan in 5 years' time, 4 years' time, largely because you just go and read NPF4, because that is now the basis of everything. So that's a big eye opener. That's really helpful for communities when they realise that. The question is, can you argue for NPF4 policies to be changed. I doubt it. You could argue for a different application of NPF, use NPF4 to argue for a particular application of policy that you would like to see in a particular place in your area. But arguing, yeah, I'd love to turn that into discussion.
The Parliament has adopted NPF4. That's it.
Yeah,
for the foreseeable. But I would also say NPF4 policies, as admirable as they are, they're discretionary. So that you would then seek to apply them through reason as to how they should be applied spatially within your local area. So you would have to frame it as not a challenge to NPF4, but as the art of planning of using the policy to argue for weighting your argument in the way that the private sector does. One of the questions from Tim Moss, going back to actually, I suppose, the CAP LPP issue was, does it make sense for a community group to send out consultations for both at the same time, see the level of response they get on a spatial level, and see whether to proceed with an LPP at that point?
Yeah, I mean, that's what we've been saying to them, is to communities that we're working with, is if you're going to be casting your net out for a neighbourhood-wide community consultation, maybe you could do that in such a way. Basically, what's interesting is I say to communities that what do you think the Scottish Government says must be done consultation-wise for an LPP to be legitimate? Must. And the answer is there's nothing that must be done by communities. What must be done is that communities in their local place plan must give an account, a clear description of the consultation that they have done. That's because the Scottish Government don't want to be prescriptive and they don't want to overburden communities. So, and they're trusting that communities will want to be accountable to their own actual neighbours as to the mandate they formed and to have done their consultation to the best of their ability. So you can design a consultation engagement strategy that would get all the information that you want, and then you can figure out what you want to do with it. Basically, that's what I would say, Tim. So you could then say, okay, well, first of all, we're just going to work towards the cap because that feels like enough for us. But then we're going to make sure that we take all those spatial elements and then think forward about how to make sure that that can become an LPP and be validated. For example, send out an information notice if we haven't done the equivalent. But that will take a bit more time, I guess, doing it that way.
I suppose
make those choices depending on.
Yeah, I don't not picking on anybody, but because I know there's a number of people from Aberdeenshire on the call today, and one of the reasons that we were working in Peterhead was because it was a really honest acknowledgement from Aberdeenshire Council around the number of consultations that they had undertaken in Peterhead over a few years, but they were all separate and from separate bits of local government, and the community will have done stuff as well. And to me, there's an issue around communities leading on things, but the using that as an opportunity to gather other information that is not necessarily just for the CAP or just for an LPP, but around a range of issues that are of interest to the publics and third sectors. And using that sort of consultation process to gather a huge amount of information, which we then use appropriately for different bits of named plans or different acronyms. But it's not. But when you're consulting the public, you're not asking them. You're not saying to them, "This is for a local place plan" or "This is for a community action." It's like, we need to know how you feel about your. It's a place principle approach where you're doing a holistic approach to the settlement.
Yep.
Now, are there any other questions? Have I missed any questions? We can see the Land Commissioner doing some research on transparency in response to Claire's question. Nick Wright is saying the LPPs have a role in developing NPF5. He's really looking forward to NPF5. We've just had NPF4 adopted, but yes, no doubt the LPP process may help what NPF5 looks like. One of my questions, because the SURF's main interest is in how policy lands in communities that are experiencing economic deprivation. From your perspective, what opportunities does this offer and what specific challenges does this offer? And are you, in the ones that you're working with in Fife, and I know some of them and I know some of the people and they're great people, but they're not necessarily driven by poverty in their area. They're wanting to shape to improve their places. are there opportunities here that are specifically good for communities that are in poverty?
I think so. Here's my take. If let's say that we actually make LPPs work, and in 3 or 4 years' time, I can't remember, the review basically goes, okay, this is working, and we can keep going with it. If we get to that point and we're basing that decision on the fact that they've worked in basically wealthy communities, then I don't think they're actually working. I think that if LPPs are seen to be working and to have integrity, they must clearly be seen to have made a meaningful difference to communities that are in the lowest, in the forgotten five, as I call it, the lowest 5% of the SIMD, or wherever you want to cut it off. So I'm just reflecting back on Postle Park, where I used to stay. And in Fife, there's like one group in Benati that might be looking to do this stuff that you would think might be classified that way. I think absolutely, because our communities that we've got geographic segregation of poverty from wealth. That's the truth. It's really stark. Let's say Glasgow, Postle Park, Bearsden. And what we're trying to say through community wealth building legislation is we want to enable communities to begin to get on their own feet and work towards establishing their own, more than ever before, their own local assets and economies, right? Now, that must also be seen to be working if it's to have any integrity in our poorest communities. And I do believe that whether it's, but often you don't find that there aren't that, or my experience is that there aren't that many communities that have the energy, like in Postle Park, all the groups that are working there, they're trying to deal with survival issues, with helping people just get through daily life. And a lot of the folk on the grounds are understandably just doing this, head down. And so I think the opportunity here is to provide extra support to enable an actual neighborhood-wide process that really enables both in a CAP way, community organizing, and in a local place planning way, advocacy to the spatial planning department. And I think there are really big opportunities there, but more than any other community, like I get that the Scottish government might be saying we can't give money to anyone directly because we need to be seen to be equal, but that's the tension of universal versus like being partial. And supporting poorer communities to get up isn't to be excluding other communities. It's going, look, the world is excluding the poor, and we want to make up for that and give you some extra resources. And I think there is money there. We're just not necessarily choosing to allocate it the way that we could do to meet young Hamza's goal. Like, are we actually poverty impact assessing the potential of LPPs? I'm not sure we are yet.
Right. Thank you very much. Final question, because you've touched on it quite a lot. How are CAPs received by councils?
CAPs?
Yeah, CAPs. How are they received?
Spatial planning? Well, okay.
No, community action plans.
Yeah. So interestingly, I discovered in the 2013 development, I'm just going to talk from a spatial planning perspective first of all. In the 2013 development management guidelines, in the back, Appendix 1, what are material considerations? I discovered retrospectively that a community action plan in that document was actually listed as a material consideration. Didn't know that. I know routinely, myself and other planning colleagues would never have proactively gone, is there a community action plan that might influence this application, despite it being a material consideration? Now that changed in the 2022 DM guidelines. It's community action plans out and LPP is in as a material consideration, right? But then in the development planning guidelines that have just come out, rather than DM guidelines, it makes it really clear that a CAP may be a material consideration. So what I would say is we should be paying a lot of attention to CAPs. I don't think we have remotely routinely done that from within community planning department, spatial planning departments. Maybe we should be a lot more from now on, because that's what the guidance suggests we should be doing. And in terms of other council departments, I would hesitate to say, but as a community leader, my understanding is that a lot of CAPs, the energy that communities have brought to them are not often grabbed and run with and distributed and advocated for by local authority teams or people within other siloed departments, and it just falls between the stools, and that's what generates such cynicism. And so one of the core delivery questions, I think, around LPPs and CAPs and making them work is that local authorities maybe need to seize the opportunity of all this energy that might be upsurging and think about how we're going to make sure that we've got some dedicated people that can run the gauntlet and make sure that this stuff gets networked into what we're doing.
Good answer, very honest answer, which is one that I think we'll all recognise. And maybe there's an event on CAPS in itself in the future. My local church has just tolled the 11th hour, so we're running 5 minutes over. Tim Moss has a really good question for you, but I'm going to leave you maybe to answer that question in the chat, and I'm going to pause the meeting just now. And if you all come back at 11:10, but thank you very much, Paul. That was a really great presentation. We'll see you all in 10 minutes.
Thank you so much. Real privilege.
Welcome back, everybody. And thank you very much for all the comments and questions that we have got in the chat. Some good questions still for Paul, and some other good links being put in by other people who are on the call. I think, Paul, one of Paul's suggestions could there be a national register for local place plans? We're not at that stage yet. We're still looking at registers within local authorities, and not all local authorities are in the same place in creating or publishing their register of local place plans. But as I said, one of the first organisations that has been out of the traps is Loch Lomond and Trossachs National Park Authority. So we've invited Fiona Jackson and Sarah Brooks to join us this morning, and they are going to share on their reflections on the creation of the register. And as I've put a link in the response to Tristan's question, a link to the register, and you can see that there are some local place plans already on that. So they may have some reflections both on the creation of the register, but also they may have reflections on things that Paul has already commented on. So over to you, Fiona and Susan.
Thanks, Ewan. Are you okay to share our presentation as we've run through earlier? We were just having issues here. Thanks, Emma.
That's it.
Perfect. Thank you. Thanks for inviting us along to share our reflections. So we are a National Park Authority, but we're also the full planning authority for the National Park area. So we're talking very much from our experience to date, and I think, as Paul said earlier, very much just finding our way through the new system and the new process. So we're not saying we've got everything right. We've just been feeling our way along. So we're really happy today just to share our approach. My name's Susan Brooks, and I'm the Communities and Place Planning Manager here. I'm joined by Fiona Jackson within our team. Fiona's been leading mainly on our local place plan work. So we're just doing a bit of a tag team today to share our slides with you. So just move on to the next one, please, Emma. So firstly, just to give a brief overview of the context and how we work in the area that we work for. So the national park here has a population of around 14,700. That was on the last census. Our population's declined a little bit. And we work with around 21 communities around the park, all of which are small rural communities. So we're talking very much from our experience working with smaller communities. And they're varied across the park. The park itself is on the edge of the central conurbation, so we have a swathe of communities that are really very accessible to Glasgow and Stirling, a number of quite affluent communities, but we've also got a number of communities in more remoter parts of the national park area with real challenges across them. Callander is probably our largest settlement in the east of the park, with a population of around 2,000. So that's the kind of geography and the nature of the communities that we work with, and how we've been supporting them to prepare their local place plans. I've just popped up the 4 statutory aims of the National Park as well, which I'm not going to run through them in detail, but just again to flag our unique context in that as a park authority, everything we do must be to achieve these 4 aims. And specifically the last aim, to promote the sustainable economic and social development of our communities, has always been an area of work that we've put a lot of time and staff resource into. We've supported communities since the park was established over 20 years ago to all prepare a community action plan. All of the communities have established their own development trusts, and they're all very able, very experienced and equipped to crack on with doing their action planning. So the transition for us over the last few years, just reflecting on what you were saying earlier, Paul, I think for us, we've been encouraging communities to not stop preparing community action plans. We've been really encouraging them to keep going with that, the spirit of preparing a community action plan, but to turn it into a local place plan. So our approach has been very much with these small rural communities to make them the one plan. And there's been an appetite and a desire for that, and quite a good level of agency built within our communities now to support one another and share their experiences. Mixed success, lots of different views, but that's definitely the approach that we are going for within the park area. So the next slide, please, Emma. This just is to give you a bit of a feel for our team. We have got like I said, we're a full planning authority, so we have our forward planning, development planning section, which is our team, and we also have a development management team. But I think what works well for us is that we have communities, staff and planners in the one team, so we're able to fuse this really well. So the kind of things that we work on a day-to-day basis is around supporting community development and capacity building. We work really closely with the statutory local authorities to support our communities on that as well. We support our communities to continue to influence and lead and have good capacity there and to participate fully in decision making that affects them. We do support quite a lot of community-led project delivery, although our role in relation to that has become much more hands-off over time, with a lot of skill sets within communities now to keep doing that themselves. We support communities on local place plans, and we've put quite a lot of time and effort into doing that. But also within our team, we also help prepare some of the other statutory plans and policies for the park authority. So that includes a National Park Partnership Plan, which is our overall plan to set out how the 4 aims of the park are to be achieved by us and others. And we also prepare our new local development plan, which we intend to also function as a land use framework for the park as well. So our work contributes to a lot of local-led initiatives, but also we try to strongly align that and see how we can respond to some of our national policies and priorities around climate, nature, land reform and community wealth building, for example. So we feel within the team that we can use local place plans and our connection with communities to try and align all of these documents together. So that's just a bit of background from me. If we can move on to the next slide, please, Emma. I'm going to hand over to Fiona, who's going to talk a bit more specifically about our communities and some of the stuff that they've been working on.
Hi, yeah. I'm not going to talk in great detail because we haven't got loads of time, but this slide really was just to give a flavour of some of the sort of thriving voluntary action that we've got in the national park. Despite all this activity, though, that you can see here, we also see the challenges for our community bodies to grow and thrive. Some of the challenges are about our very tiny and actually ever reducing populations, from which our community organisations can recruit volunteers, and this can often lead to a bit of divisive community politics and burnout. Paul mentioned those things too. Lack of access to funding, so these challenges always come up for everybody, but for the rural areas too, especially not meeting funding criteria, some of the national and third sector funding opportunities, which are often targeted at communities being able to evidence multiple deprivation, which doesn't mean to say that our communities don't have deprivation or multiple deprivation, but sometimes it's difficult to evidence that. So lack of funding as for everyone. Lack of capacity building support, Paul mentioned that too. Funding for development activities and core work is just a real barrier to developing sort of third sector within the area. And for us particularly, there's some issues around kind of lack of awareness around the influence of wider land use and land management that can, affect an impact on quality of life for people, but also for the environment, which is obviously one of our high priorities. These and other factors kind of compound each other and can lead to anchor bodies like community councils and trusts either dissolving or being dysfunctional or simply limiting their activities and aspirations. So although we're saying we've got a thriving community sector, it's not all perfect, and there's a lot of issues that will affect the sort of sustainability of the place and the people. So next slide, please, Emma. So this next slide is hopefully, it's a lot of writing, and apologies for that, but I'm just getting down. I'm the kind of nitty-gritty process person, so I'm going to just talk a little bit of our thoughts on what's been happening here. And it gives a quick overview of what we've been kind of doing, the journey to date. In 2021, we delivered some early kind of pilot place plans. We called them community plans. We didn't really know what to call them. It was before the Planning Act came out, or it was just before anyway, or at the same time. We included spatial elements, working with communities, our planning officers and the communities team working with communities, and we were feeling our way. We set up at the same time a community sounding board of representatives from the community that were really interested in getting involved, to prepare a kind of training event, a big kind of summit on local place plans in the national park, which almost all our community bodies attended. We also identified some resources that we could offer from our own staff, supporting data collection, mapping opportunities from our GIS team, planning team, and our engagement advice. And at the same time, began to identify and argue for a budget that we could use to support communities to do their own work. And that sort of led us on into the 2022 year, after the publication of the local place plan guidance. So we got a little bit more kind of direction of what the heck we were doing. We set up our local place plan website that had a load of information on it, and we really were informed by a lot of other organisations and planning authorities on that who were ahead of us. So we used a lot of their ideas to be able to get this information up. And we sent out a formal invite following the guidance to all of our communities to see if they wanted to prepare a local place plan with hopefully with explanations of what the two things were: community action plans, local place plans. Could they be combined? We provided, during that time, some in-kind and technical support. A lot of time was spent on this with eight communities. We organised the funding so that the communities could commission their own specialist support, and we tried to support. One of the things that we really wanted them to be looking at, if they could, was the climate and land use considerations, as well as kind of assets and enterprise, the community wealth building side of things. We tried to support the climate stuff. it hasn't worked brilliantly, and as Paul said, I think lots of work needs to go on in that arena. But at the same time, we were sort of monitoring ourselves, reflecting on what we were doing. This year, we've continued to support 6 communities, and yeah, we drafted some local place plan validation procedures for our organisation based on what we were guided from the circular. And we also have an issue of some of these early pilots that we didn't have the circular for. We didn't know what the heck we were doing in terms of validation. So we're now working with those communities who prepared and published their place plans on the final validation phases. We formalised we've called a local place plan advisory group. So that sounding board that we had a couple of years ago, we've continued working with them, learning from them, and they are very articulate people. And we've tried to develop terms of reference to formalise their role. That's still evolving, and we're looking at reporting mechanisms, monitoring framework for all of this work. We have found that 5 communities haven't engaged. They haven't shown interest in local place plans. Some of the councillors have wanted us to push them into doing a local place plan and persuade them, but we haven't taken that up yet. So we've still got gaps, if that's what you want to call it. But maybe that they have every right, as Paul suggests, to not do a local place plan. But we do want to make sure that their views for the local development plan, that is, we're evolving and we are starting to work on our second one, we must make sure their views are taken into account, even though they haven't got a local place plan, which we will through the LDP consultation. Just want to mention, I'm not a planner, so I sometimes use the wrong words, and I also challenge that lot who are the planners in my team. So it's a good tit for tat we have here at the park. So if you could move on to the next slide, please, Emma. I just wanted to kind of prove to you and to us that we have actually done these things. I think there are people on the call who are involved in some of these things. So I just wanted to give you a bit of a visual. That these are some of the event flyers that some of the communities have developed. Next slide. This is real quick run through, Emma. The next one is just some of the, you know, the flip chart stuff that people do. Everyone's familiar with this sort of work. This was an example in, I think it was in Loch, this area. And it's a example of how the place standard has been part of the whole process. And the next slide, please, Emma. Some examples of the graphics used that the communities and the people they've worked with have used to explain results and the prioritisation activities. And the next slide, please. Just gives you some colour if it's not all writing. And here are some of the front covers of some of the place plans that have been published. Some of them have been validated, and others we're working with them to validate them. So it kind of reflects the different approaches, so it's not consistent. Each community has chosen how they're going to spend their money or develop their place plans. So I'm going to pass this over to Susan now. Next slide, please, Emma. And Susan's just going to talk about 2 or 3 more specific examples that aren't place plans necessarily, but some of the aligning issues and impacts that we need to take into account.
Thanks, Fiona. So yeah, the first example, as you'll see, is an example from Drimmen within the park area. So this was a community that we knew wanted to prepare a new local place plan. They had an existing community action plan that was needing reviewed, and they were really keen to work with us to look at that. One of the issues we've experienced with community action plans and local place plans, working with our communities, is that they tend to be quite insular. The communities are focused very much on themselves, and that tended to be, you know, in the kind of settlement area, and we were really keen to think more widely, to include consideration of the wider rural area. And in the Drimmen instance, we were keen for Drimmen to work with neighbouring communities because we knew that there was common issues we were seeing common issues coming up across lots of different CAPs and local police plans that were emerging. And for Drimmen, Cruftamy, Kilmarnock, East Loch, the whole swathe up East Loch Lomond side, there was real issues around transport, active travel, housing, and a number of issues that we were keen that they explored jointly. So prior to doing their local police plan, we were able to work with them and to commission a piece of work that was led by Fourth Environment Link on behalf of the communities. We funded it, and it was to do a pilot study on local living. So this work was done just in advance of the community then preparing their local police plan, and that was able to secure quite good outputs and content within the plan. You'll see there some mapping that was included that was exploring some of the connections and priorities and future project activity around strengthening active travel within the area. So that was good for the community. It's given them a good, strong local police plan. They're really delighted with it. But for us, thinking ahead to preparing a local development plan, we were able to use this as just another way of trying and testing approaches and see what works and how we can roll this out and support other areas of the park. The next slide, please, Emma, is an example from the Strathard area of the National Park, which for those of you who know the park area, this is Aberfoyle and the landward area stretching westwards right up to include Loch Catrin and up to Inversnaid. This was a community we were keen to work with to explore how land use further up the Strath, how land use change can help influence and address some of the issues that are being experienced within the towns and villages, specifically flooding. So we were keen to consider not just planning and infrastructure improvements, but also how land use can be influenced and help support a range of outcomes. The process itself was, I think, was probably just as, if not more valuable than the actual framework document that came out the other end. The process brought together the community were leading themselves on individual local police plans for some of the smaller areas within the Strathard overall area. So it allowed us to bring that together, and it also brought in other stakeholders as well from public and private sector. So the process to preparing this plan and what we'd like to see in local police plans is about bringing this range of stakeholders together to consider quite a wide range of issues. The next example, sorry, I'm just quickly running through these. Most of these documents are all on our website if anyone's interested in having a look at them. This example is some work we're doing with Loch Goyle. We've been working with this community for a number of years, starting back in 2017 when we supported the community there to prepare a community action plan at that point in time. But we knew at that point in time that local police plans were on the horizon, so an early action for us there was to try and work with that community to start considering more spatial elements and to try and nudge this CAP on to see how it could become a local police plan. So you'll see down there in the bottom left-hand corner just an example of some of the mapping outputs that came from that project. This community's went on to deliver a whole plethora of projects, including their own community garden, community land acquisition, and some really nice projects along their riverside restoration. So they're doing a lot for nature as well within that area of the park. In 2022, we worked with them through a project we're involved in with the Scottish Government. We're a pilot area for them looking at regional land use partnerships. And we really wanted to work with this community to see how we can encourage and support local communities to think more about climate and nature and land use as part of their local police planning process, which was new for us. So we did some really good work with Loch Goyle, and they went on to produce their own land use vision. which they now in turn are going to use this land use vision to inform a new local place plan that they are just embarking on just now. So that's been a wee bit of a journey with that community, but another example, I guess, of how we're just really trying to test and push and use this local place plan process as a way of delivering not just outcomes that are community-led outcomes, but help deliver wider outcomes for us at the national park area as well. The next slide, please, Emma, is just pulling together some of our thoughts and reflections on what's been working well in our experience at the national park. But we feel that local place plans do work well, and we would be and are encouraging our communities to crack on and prepare them. We are providing support as and where we can. We're a small team. We do have a small budget, but we have to be very proportionate and flexible in terms of how we support that. We are building here on a strong legacy of our communities, having had community action plans previously, and many of whom still have the same skill sets in place. For us, it's about building a relationship with our communities. That's within our team, but also just bringing in other staff from other teams as well, so that we do have known and effective working relationships across the park area. We also find that it helps build relationships between communities. So the process ourselves, we mentioned that we've established a small group of community representatives, but also it's a good way to get communities working together, especially if there's cross-boundary issues or areas that it's better for communities to work together to try and tackle some of these issues. We've used the process as far as we can to empower communities more. To begin with, when we were looking at providing some support, I was really keen to appoint someone, probably a consultancy such as PAS perhaps, to go out and support our communities, but Fiona rightly pointed out it actually should be for communities themselves to decide what support they need and for them to bring that in. So that's what we've tried to do. So yeah, we really feel that this is a golden opportunity for us, and our mantra that we keep coming back to is that local framing drives engagement. So certainly for all of our other plans that we need to prepare, our strategic national park plan and our local development plan, the best way for us to engage is in our experience for us to plug in as much as we can at local place plan level. I've got one other slide just with some reflections, if we can move on to that one. Just some of the areas that maybe are working not so much less well, but just some of the things we're still working through. Oops, let's go back. Perfect. So yeah, the local place plans we're seeing, they're all different, which is great, but the content is variable. So there are some where we'd like to see a bit more spatial content coming through. We find that we have had to give some support generally on the spatial elements, and that support's not been huge levels of support, not hugely intensive, but certainly some mapping, giving some data, some stats, sitting around a table with people to talk about NPF4, to talk about the local development plan, to have discussions around a map, about land, sites, and help engage, and that helps us understand what local views and perspectives are as well. As I said, we have limited staff time and capacity, so we have had to be very proportionate and to try and plan ahead as much as we can. That's been a real challenge for us because we have an annualised budget, so we don't always know what our budget is year on year, so we have to manage that very, very carefully. We've really worked hard to try and encourage and use this engagement as an opportunity for us to open up our working with communities to talk about wider national park issues that we know we need to plan for, but that may not be fully on a community's radar or might not be the most pressing issue for them at this point in time, but it's been something that we felt has been important for us to start exploring with them. And as I said, there's still a bit of a tendency for them to be inward looking, so we are really keen to start opening up discussion about the rural landward area, and ideally what we'd love to see coming forward at a future point in time is some communities joining together and doing area-wide plans. Whether that happens or not, I don't know. If it doesn't, that role will fall to the local development plan. So I'll just hand back to Fiona. We're just got a few more slides just on our thoughts and a bit more detail on the process.
Thank you. Yes, the next slide. Thank you. So some of our reflections on the sort of the process. I've become a bit of a process local place plan geek, but I still don't know it all at all. Funding communities directly has enabled them, we feel, to control their own plans and their own process. However, project planning, procurement, outputs, all of these things have to be evidenced to pay invoices. So some of our communities have found these processes challenging, as have I, trying to make sure it's seamless for them, but are still meet our auditors' requirements. It's been a bit of a nightmare. Another interesting aspect has been the fact that they've used different consultants. Some people have used consultants, others have done it themselves and they've not used our money, or they've used it just for publishing the plan. So there's been quite a variation in both costs of consultants, skills of consultants. It's been really interesting learning about how communities are deciding to commission and who they're deciding to commission and how they work with people. Our funding contributions have required legal kind of contracts, legal agreements, and this has actually been quite useful for us in enabling us to influence what we feel is the quality of engagement and content of the plans. For example, encouraging consideration of climate and land use, some of the things that aren't normally considered or haven't traditionally been considered in local place plans. So it's been a gentle way of saying, well, what about thinking about this, or else we won't give you the money. But we haven't been as mean as that. So it's been a lot of flexible negotiation and support. Conversations on the purpose of local place plans have been really insightful, and Paul mentioned this. The idea of getting a balance between how the community priorities and actions are expressed, with the requirement also to articulate the planning issues that will inform the LDP. We've had a lot of conversations about that with communities raising questions, and us questioning ourselves about why we're doing this and what we're doing it for. We're trying to combine the two in the most pragmatic way possible. We're still learning really how best to support communities to map their proposals, you know, which software to use, how sophisticated this should be, how can it be transferred easily into our GIS system that will then be used in our LDP, because we want to be able to take on as many proposals as possible from communities. We've also had kind of, you know, the slipping timeline of this Blue and LDP. It keeps slipping, and so I've had to keep informing people about the submission deadline for the local place plan, because it can be extended, which gives people more time, which is great, but it does cause a bit of confusion. So I've got to keep in really strong touch with communities all the time who are doing this piece of work. And then sort of finally, some of our community council boards cross into other local authority planning authority boundaries, because we cover 4 different local authorities. So that's caused a lot of complexity and kind of questions that I don't think have yet been answered by us or anyone else about how to work and agree with local authorities. Do we just validate a local place plan in respect of our national park boundary, even though there might be proposals in another local authority who's not ready, their LDP, they're not ready to be starting to validate plans. So we're still, you know, we've got a lot of questions. Next slide, please, Emma, because I wanted to talk a little bit of how our sort of validation stuff, some of the other things. So we realised we did need to develop a kind of checklist. So one of my planning colleagues drafted a checklist to say, well, if you've got a place plan in front of you, what are the things that we have to see in it? We looked at the guidelines, the government guidelines, and had that kind of minimum level. And so we're only kind of basing it on that minimum level of what has to be in and what the process has to be. We designed some templates to support communities to prepare their information notice, because it was becoming really quite complicated, remembering all the things that had to be done. We also designed a sort of template to help them think through the submission statement, and this thing about, you know, amendments to the local development plan, these planning issues that are really so planning orientated that ordinary people just don't know how to express them, but they know what they want. So we've had to go through quite a lot of support and thinking of how that can be best organised and how they can be best supported. It's also been interesting to explore the sort of level of spatial detail required to inform the new LDP and amend, you know, the current LDP. Should local place plans make it easy for planners to transfer proposals to the LDP, or should communities produce content that they understand, meaning that planners must analyse the plan and spend time to interpret their spatial intentions? I've had a few arguments or interesting discussions with my colleagues on that one. We've also been working with our communities who have produced CAPs or local place plans, like I said, before the guidance was produced. So yeah, we're grappling with some of these issues around producing submission statements and information notices that meet the circular, the guidance, but without having to amend the plan that they've already published, and we supported them to do it. So we've kind of sometimes been a bit ahead of ourselves, and then have had to go back and go, oh goodness, we need to relook at how we do that. So we accept we are not perfect. Next slide, please, Emma, because I wanted just to talk a bit about to set how it's important to set local place plans in the context of the wider national park and our evolving priorities and the wider priorities of the communities. Our executive team approved some protocols that we put forward, along with proposals for sharing and promoting the community place plans once they are validated and then registered. We wanted to make sure that they were shared with staff across all of our teams, with our board, our National Park Authority board, and with the 4 community planning partnerships that we share with our local authorities. We've sort of started doing that now because we've only just registered 4 local place plans, and we hope that this process will ensure that stakeholders have cognizance of the local place plans. We can't control what they're doing, but we can try and facilitate as much as possible when they're developing their investment plans. So that communication of the sort of final validated plan via planning authority needs to have much more wider impact. We eventually did validate the 4 local place plans, and we recorded them on our new registration web page, which we set up as soon as we had realised that we needed to actually register them. So again, it's done quite quickly. So again, it might not be perfect. We're now working on other processes and issues, such as what happens if a local place plan doesn't have an outline delivery plan. It's not a requirement in the guidance, but you know, what's the point otherwise? Because it's all about action really, as well as influence. We want to think about developing a monitoring system to inform that 7-year review by Scottish ministers, because they're saying they'll need information in 7 years about the impact of local place plans, both in terms of proposals delivered and how local place plans have influenced planning decisions. So some real fruity bits of stuff that we need to face ourselves as a planning authority, I think. We also need to co-design. We want to co-design that system so it simultaneously supports communities and what they're wanting to achieve from their plans, and to monitor, and for ourselves to monitor the progress and the impact. So next slide, please, Emma. What about the future? Well, we still need to work on how to support communities this year with our limited resource. That's always a challenge. How do we encourage and enable local place plans to say more on climate, more on asset ownership, and more on wealth building? Perhaps this will have to happen in local place plan delivery phase. We can't get it all done in one go so early on. I think there's a real journey of building awareness and knowledge for all of us, and perhaps we're going to have to do that through delivery. if new issues emerge, and this is something again as a non-planning geek, but I kind of know a little bit now, if the new issues emerge over the next 5 to 10 years for communities or for us as Scotland, how will communities either refresh their plans or influence the new local development plan? We're unclear on the review and refresh arrangements, so we've got to think those through and ask others, like government, about some of that. And we're also concerned about how local place plan proposals will be delivered. Projects may need to be led by a community or could be a responsibility of another statutory body or private sector partnership. How can a community be supported to coordinate this process? And this is the thing that we worry about all of the time. Funding and support comes into all of that. So it's something that we're just very aware of and need to think about, but we haven't got the answers. But I'm gonna, on the next slide, pass over to Susan just to finish us off.
Yeah, just to try and wrap it all up. So I think you'll see that from our point of view, we're all for local place plans, and we would certainly be encouraging all of our communities to prepare them. We think that within the national park context, where we're working with small rural communities with a number of issues facing us, specifically thinking about our kind of park-wide priorities around climate, nature, land use, land reform, community empowerment, community wealth building, we would really like to see local place plans saying much more in relation to all of these topics. And that's looking as well at their communities, what's traditionally within the settlement, but all the land round about them as well, to help unlock opportunity there for them. We see them really as being a good mechanism to bring in wider stakeholders as well. And we've seen some success in that area, but that's also something that we'd like to keep working on to really help progress the place principle that we're all striving to achieve. But we know to deliver it, communities need ongoing support in terms of retaining capacity, retaining an element of funding. We've talked about funding quite a lot. We don't have a huge budget, and we've not given typically huge amounts of funding towards communities, but we've found that a little bit of funding can have quite a bit of impact, especially when it's left to them to decide how is best to use that. And we really see these local place plans as being a way to empower communities to influence not just development, but holistically the whole of the place and the national park area. So the very, very last slide, Emma, please, is just thank you from us for the opportunity to talk to you and for listening, and welcome any questions or follow-up conversations if required or helpful. Thanks you. Thanks, Emma.
Thank you very much, and thank you very much to both of you for the presentation and for Emma for going through the slides really well. It's really interesting to see you combining some of the things that Paul talked about, the combination of community action plans with local place plans, and the fact that you were building on some strong work within the authority area on community action plans. Interestingly, in last September, Richard Boddington from Drimmen gave a presentation about their experience of doing it was primarily around 20-minute neighbourhoods. So it was really helpful to hear from your side. He had a lot of positive things to say in his presentation, and I shared a link in the chat about to that meeting. So it was interesting to hear your perspective on that. In terms of questions, there's been quite a few questions. Kaylee Doyle, you had quite an early on question. I don't know if you want to ask the question of Fiona and Susan.
Hi everyone, hi. Yeah, my question was about funding. It's such a great presentation, really useful to see what's happening in the national park. And you talked about funding a lot, but just maybe a bit more practically about how the national park is structured, how the funding has worked for yourselves, and what lessons there are to apply that elsewhere. Really useful. Thank you.
Yeah, so we're a non-departmental government body, so we get a capital and revenue budget from the Scottish Government every year, so it's annualised budgets, which is a bugbear for us, Kiri, because it's hard. It's really hard to know what we're getting. We typically do get a small budget every year for our community's work, But for Fiona working directly with communities who don't work from April to April, and a local place plan definitely takes longer, it's really hard knowing what we can and cannot offer. But we've successfully bid and been allocated a budget every year. Not a lot. I'm talking about £20,000 typically is been what our budget has been. And Fiona's worked with communities to give small awards of literally just a few £1,000s per community, and the communities either use that to appoint a development worker to come in and do a bit of the support work, some design, the consultation, various pieces of work, or and then staff in kind. We've provided more support through staff in kind through either support from Fiona or support from some of our planners within the team, or from GIS data mapping. That seems to be a common request, and that's probably where we dedicate most of our support to.
Can I ask a question? Can I ask a question on the back of it? Because you said some communities asked for more money and commissioned consultants and some didn't. Did any communities access funding from elsewhere to fund a local place plan?
Yeah, actually, one community did, from an organisation called the Community Chartering Network. They're the ones who worked in the Strathard area. That they started what we're calling it a local place plan, but they didn't even know about local place plans. They had experienced some community action planning work that we had funded years ago. But they were like, no, we want to do something for ourselves, and they developed something called community life plans, and they completely set this up themselves. And then we started getting involved because we thought this is really good, and we started then giving them funding as well. So they had got some seed funding from the Community Chartering Network. The others, they have been, when we've been talking about money, we haven't given the same amount of money to every single community. It's been very bespoke discussions about what they want to do and what capacity they already have and what funding they've got. So some of them do have income, for example, through hydro schemes or some kind of wealth fund in their areas, usually through hydro schemes in our area. And then they have put money towards some of these processes themselves as well. So it's been a bit of a mix for each one. It's been very bespoke to each group.
Thanks very much. That's interesting. I bet it reflects, I suppose, variety within the local authority area. Slightly on the back of that, Michael Ward, who's a Glasgow-based planner, you may know, he asked, does the LPP model potentially work better in well-defined, smaller rural communities than it might in a less well-defined urban context?
Yeah, well, I think there'll be principles and approaches that would apply no matter what the geographic area is, but our experience has only been working with rural communities, and what we find is a rural community typically identifies with their community council area, which is typically the glen or the strath or the landscape level that they can resonate and identify with. So that's what works best. We would like to see, I personally would like to see groupings of community councils so that we've got an area, a bigger geographic area, and that's a challenge for us over the next few years. I think if communities were going on to prepare their second iteration of a local place plan, maybe we could support that. But I guess the challenge for a successful local place plan is the geography needs to be a geography that people identify with, and you can frame your engagement at that level. So whether that's an urban or a rural area, I guess it's the same challenge.
Yeah, we've had discussions with communities about this, and I think that some people would argue differently from Susan and say that's up to the professionals with all the money in their statutory bodies to bring all that stuff together and look at the cross-boundary issues. We want to talk about our community, understanding that we've got adjoining contexts, but actually no, this is our area that we want to talk about. So yeah, I think there's different ways of doing it.
Yes, interesting. I know that we had discussions with it was with one of the Ayrshire councils, who had 3 settlements who were doing place planning. They were keen for them to do them together, but the communities didn't. They saw themselves as, you know, autonomous, unique settlements with their own issues that they wanted to focus on. I could see from a planning authority perspective why there was a desirability of them together, but I think that is an interesting response that you've had. That it's in the interest of the planning authority or the local authority to deliver that, so they should maybe do that. Claire Simmons, I know you've had a question. There's been some chat going on in the sidebar, but I don't know if you want to unmute and ask your question of Fiona and Susan.
Yes, which one?
The one on if a decision is made that is contrary to what the local place plan said.
Yes. I just as you know, we've been campaigning for equal rights of appeal for many years, and one of the reasons we the circumstances that we put forward is what happens if a community have spent a long time developing a local place plan, and that's successfully incorporated into a local development plan, maybe a specific policy or an allocation or whatever, and then an application comes forward for a development that runs contrary to that proposal or that LDP. Should that community have a right to appeal the decision and ask for it to be looked at again?
Right, answer that.
have a staff, you know, it's your personal opinion, but professional reality.
Well, my opinion is if a community has worked hard and prepared a local place plan which clearly articulates their views and reasons over why a piece of land or a site should be zoned or used for a particular use, if that's brought through into a local development plan, which I think is what you were saying, Claire, then that has primacy. Whatever that land use is, that has primacy in decision making. I'm not able to comment further on rights of appeal.
I suppose Claire's question, because actually one of the people that isn't here today, Malcolm Fraser, had signed up for this, and I expected him to bring that up as a topic from when his previous practice did a charrette, and it was in a Fife settlement, and the charrette produced recommendations, and then planning decisions were made that didn't respect the outcomes of the charrette. And, you know, Malcolm was deeply frustrated on behalf of the community that happened, because it was like, well, why ask if it then doesn't happen, particularly around creating a plan. But I suppose the local place plans are in a similar position. While yes, it has primacy, but the discretionary nature of the planning system may mean that another issue outweighs in the final decision making, that a decision could be made that land is developed on, even though the community have identified it maybe for an alternative purpose. And unfortunately, we're in a planning system that allows that to happen. Claire's question about should we have the community have a right of appeal, then we need to change the system rather than to kind of allow that to happen, would be the thing that I think would be necessary.
Yeah, I think if it makes it through into the local development plan, then that's it. It's got primacy there. But if it hasn't, for whatever reason, I wouldn't know what that circumstance would be. But I think that's why, from our point of view, I would want our planners, if a community is preparing a local place plan, I would want us to be plugged in. And we are fortunate in that we can do that because we're part of the same team and we are largely plugged in. So there should be very limited instances where if something comes through in a local place plan that doesn't make it the full way through to a local development plan, or if there is going to be a site or a disagreement, we'd want to talk about that as part of the process. There shouldn't be any nasty surprises coming up. I'm not saying we wouldn't agree on everything, but there should be that transparency there to know why a certain proposal or site maybe wouldn't progress.
It's the timing, of course, because if it's got through to the LDP, then it has primacy. There's a debate during that process, whether it should or shouldn't. But then there's the point that once the LDP is there, and if there's a local place plan that is either produced afterwards, after the LDP is published, or has a proposal in it that we didn't accept into the LDP, it's that nitty issue of the weight given to a local place plan once an LDP has already been published, I think, which has the discussion, and what weight is it given?
Thanks very much. Claire, did you want to come back on that?
Yeah, I just wanted to point out that we have, looked at quite a number of planning applications, and a lot of them do actually run contrary to development plan proposals and what is said in the development plan. Quite often conditions are put in place to sort of counter this, but as we know, conditions are not always kept to. And the number of appeals by developers at the moment, we've just done some research, and 77% of those appeals were actually on sites that are not allocated in the local development plans, and up to 50% of those are getting passed. So it is a discretionary system, and I think communities have some means of appealing or challenging a decision if that is the circumstance that it goes against what they've managed to successfully get in the local development plan. So thank you for allowing me to say my little bits of equal rights of appeal.
And nice to see you. One of the other questions, Fiona and Susan, for you, and you've touched on it, is around access to software and or funding for access to software. And I wondered if you could share with us, I think you've talked about giving people access to your GIS system. Have you used anything else? Alex Wild has shared the Community Council Scott website link in the chat. And I wonder if there's anything else you would add to that.
We don't give access to our GIS system, but our GIS people provide information and layers and data and advice. We've tried to be really open about how sophisticated the map should be. We feel that as long as it can be interpreted spatially in the projects, the places. Actually, it could be. I think in one of the government consultations, they talked about putting it on the back of an envelope, that type of thing. We're not as bad as that, but we've said, as long as there's a map that's understandable, it's about what is communicated from it. It could be really, really simple. It could be drawn through, Publisher or some basic software. We've also, though, communities have commissioned consultants who have access to their software, so they produce like fancy things that, as long as the community has had strong influence over that. Some of it, I think, sometimes can be too complicated when it's like got lots of stuff on it. There's one community that's using Parish Online, which is a community council kind of driven one through the improvement service, and they're working quite happily with that. And they're going to the sort of like that open spatial hub thing where they're downloading some of the data. We're very aware that we have data around land use and land management activities, even and nature conservation areas and stuff that we would like to see mapped on software or on maps. That's something that we're grappling with, how to provide that information. I think one community has been using Felt. I don't know, I've looked at it, and even I can do bits on that. So if I can do it, then a community can do it. And then we've got other communities who are bloody brilliant at it, because they've got their own expertise. They were ex-planners. We've got a lot of professionals in the national park. This is where the kind of like wealthy, kind of high capacity communities do have an advantage, I think. So yeah, we've got a whole range of different softwares, and we try to provide the information, signpost to it, and then the community decides how far they want to go with it. And they usually, and our GIS guy's brilliant, and he sits across the table from them, talks through what is it they're trying to do, and it often just comes down to reflecting their views in a simple way, as long as they're reflected with lines and proposals.
Okay, that's helpful. That's good, and as we've had some links put in the links to Parish Online, but that's also very true that there will be local authority will hold data sets which may not exist elsewhere or easily accessible. So it's good that you're thinking about that. One of the other questions, which comes back to some of the wider issues that Paul maybe raised in the morning, I'm scrolling back up the chat to find it, but was around that sharing of information, because as you've touched. And you've clearly got peer-to-peer support within the local authority with the communities. You've set that up in the advisory group, if I'm understanding correctly. So are you in a position to have those well-equipped, well-resourced communities assist communities that have more challenges?
So that there were two purposes really to the sort of small group, and it is a small group. It's not a democratically elected group. It's a kind of self-nominated group. That's why we needed a terms of reference to make very clear what the role of the group was, sounding board. But that has been a really useful group, because it was actually the individuals that were involved in preparing those early plans. So they have a lot of criticisms of us about how to do it and ideas of how to do it better. And that's why we've kind of continually molded the process and what the information and support. So what the information on our website has provided everybody, the public, who these people are. They agreed to that. So we've shared a lot of the network of people who are doing things already, and that's one of the things that when we have our kind of initial discussion, is go and talk to that community, go and talk to that one if you want to. Some of them do, and then some of them go, no, we can do it, we're going to do it our way. So it's kind of we give them the information anyway, and it has helped where they share and they can learn from each other. We haven't got a formal network. I'd like to see a formal network that's funded and supported to deliver that kind of sharing and knowledge sharing, but we don't actually have that funded properly yet. So that's a nudge for Susan.
Right, with her limited budget. Can I?
Yeah.
We're going to draw the session to a close. Can I thank you both very much for what you shared with us, both the level of detail that you shared with us and the level of honesty. The process that you're going through as a park authority is really quite fascinating. Your sort of ongoing iterative process of review, it sounds really, really positive. I have nothing but praise for you with the limited resources that you're working within, and obviously you deserve the most praise because you're the first authority to have a published register, which is very welcome to see, and obviously that's allowing other people to have a look at local place plans. There's obviously work to be done, but it's been really refreshing to hear your experience, and that combined with Paul's crossover experience as a trainer and working from a community perspective. So on behalf of everyone on the call, I'd like to thank you all for your contributions today. It's been very rich discussion, been very rich chat in the sidebar. I will be contacting our friends in Scottish Government who are not here today. We don't often do have people in Scottish Government there, but there's none in attendance today, because I think it's really important for them to actually probably watch this session to get some of the feedback and honest feedback they've had from all presenters and from some of the contributions in the chat. So thank you very much again. We have obviously the People in Place Network. We meet regularly. Our next meeting is on the, I had it in front of me a few minutes ago, is on the 5th of October. And we're looking at that being a slightly different theme, two different themes. One, we are possibly looking at a regional authority-wide, through Clyde Plan, their approach to 20-minute neighbourhoods across a collection of local authorities, not just within one place or local authority, but what that could mean across from a regional perspective. And we're also hoping, we've invited Architecture and Design Scotland to talk about the specific work that they've done in Stewarton around one particular place. So we hope we'll share more details with that closer to the time. And if you're here today, you're on the network, so you'll be sent an email alerting you to the more details about that. But I think that just leaves me to say thank you very much. You'll receive a link to the recording and to the presentations that we've received today after the meeting, probably later this afternoon. And you'll also have a request for any feedback to us as to how you think the event went and for future topics, not for October, but for future topics that you think it would be helpful for us to be exploring from a surf perspective. So thank you very much, and enjoy the rest of your day.